Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Reefs Go Live. We will be talking today about endangered corals and their restoration right here in the waters of Little Cayman. My name is Justine, and I will be your topside host for today. Joining me on the boat is our production team, who are working very hard behind the scenes in order to bring this episode live to you wherever you may be joining from. Also joining us is our underwater explorer Chandray, and she is wearing her specialized dive gear in order for us to be able to hear her underwater. So let's check in with her now. She can show us some of this reef life.
As always, I'm really excited to have you here with us today. So today we are going to be exploring the reef that we're on, which is Coconut Walk, and we're hoping to show you some endangered coral species here in Little Cayman. As Justine has mentioned, our topic for today is endangered coral species, which we will show you, and we'll be able to share how we restore these populations back to healthy numbers.
Amazing, and I can't wait to see what you find down there, Chandray. I hope our viewers are also excited to see some of the reef life, and as we are live, you can send in any messages or questions for us to answer throughout the show. So let's start things off by you telling us who you are and where you're joining us from today. And as today's show is about corals, can you guys at home name any species of coral? And I'll give you extra points if you can tell me if they are endangered or not. So, I'll give you a little hint here. 2 of the species of endangered corals that we're going to talk about today are named after types of deer. Maybe that will help you a little bit. Send in your questions, and whilst you're doing that, let's talk a little bit more about corals, and let's get straight into it. So, did you know that corals are animals? I'm sure a lot of you already know this, and they are actually in the same phylum as jellyfish, which is the cnidarians. So if you think of a jellyfish, it has its bulb with its tentacles coming down around the outside and a mouth in the middle. If you flip that upside down, it's very similar to what a coral polyp looks like. And thousands of these tiny little polyps are joined together to form a coral colony, which are connected by living tissue over the coral skeleton. So each polyp has tentacles around the mouth, which they use to catch particles from the water in order to feed themselves. And this is actually not the only way that they can feed themselves. The tropical corals that we have here only get around 5% of their energy from this way. So Chandray, can you tell us about how the corals get the other 95% of their energy?
The corals have a tiny microscopic algae living in their tissue known as zooxanthellae. Now, zooxanthellae is a very special kind of algae. It photosynthesizes, meaning it can create its own food and nutrients from sunlight, which it then shares with the corals. Now, this partnership between the coral and the zooxanthellae is also known as a symbiotic relationship, which is basically an interaction where both organisms benefit. Now, the zooxanthellae doesn't just give the coral nutrients, but it also gives the coral its beautiful colors. Now, when a coral becomes stressed because of warmer temperatures, it will expel the zooxanthellae from its tissue, revealing a stark white skeleton underneath its nearly transparent tissue. And this is a phenomenon known as coral bleaching. Justine, can you tell us a bit more about coral bleaching?
Sure, I can. So some of you may have heard of coral bleaching before, but what does this actually mean for the health of the corals? Many people think that when a coral is bleached that it's dead, but that's not necessarily true. The zooxanthellae can actually return to the corals, so they can recover from this bleaching event if the stress event leaves, such as the temperature of the water going back to normal. Then the zooxanthellae will re-enter the cells and it will give them back their colour, and it will once again start to provide food for the corals. So The problem that we're having these days is that because these events are happening for too long, the corals actually will eventually starve and die because the temperature will be too high for a too long period. And when this happens, we start to see algae that competes with the corals grow on top of the skeletons, and then it starts to become more of a green or greyish colour. So before we move on, we're going to check the chat to see if anybody has any shout outs or if anybody could start to name some of these coral species. So let me have a little look. We have lots of shout outs coming in. We've got Crystal Miller in Oregon, Denise Jenks, Saranac Lake, New York. So we also have a few schools joining us. We have Village Montessori in Grand Cayman, and we have Catherine from Maine. We have James from Upper Michigan, Gary from Abilene, Texas, Katie Moore. We have some more schools. We have Sir John A. Cumber Primary School, Year 3 class. Florence from France is joining us also. We have some more schools. We've got Jane and Paul in Harrow in London. We have Douglas in Westchester and Ronald in Cayman Brack. Thank you guys for signing in. Let's see if anybody has any answers about the types of corals. We also have Nathaniel who's watching from Randy's Gazebo, which is actually a dive site here in Little Cayman, so that's pretty cool that people are joining from all over the place. We have Year 6 Island Primary. Thank you guys for joining us. And here's some people that have been able to name some corals. So Jeremiah says brain coral, and this is a good one. They are very easy to spot because they look very similar to what we would imagine our brains. People saying staghorn coral, that's a great one, and we might even talk about this a little bit later on in the show. There's also a message from Erica who says there's the big fan corals, but she's not sure if they're endangered or not. So that is a good answer, and I too am a big fan of the fans. These are actually soft corals, so they don't have the hard coral skeleton underneath. And to my knowledge, they are not yet evaluated, so we're not sure if they are endangered or if the populations are healthy, which means that there's just always more to learn about the coral reefs. So thank you very much for your answers and your shout-outs. Chandre, let's go back to her now underwater, and she can tell us a little bit more about the threats that these corals face.
So sadly, coral reefs face many threats today. This can be anything from rising temperatures from climate change, overfishing, habitat destruction, tropical storms, and even diseases. So, in order for us to really understand the threats to corals, we need to learn about the impacts. We've already learned a little bit about coral bleaching, so it would be important to learn a bit more. So if we look at a stressed coral that may be bleached, these corals are more susceptible to diseases. Now we can find a variety of coral diseases in the Caribbean, such as white band and black band disease. And an interesting fact about these kind of diseases is that they sometimes only infect or attack a certain species of coral. White band disease, for example, only attacks acropora corals. Now we will get to learn about these acropora corals a little bit later, but this further increases the vulnerability and the stress of these corals and inhibits their ability to survive later on. Justine, can you tell us a little about other threats to coral reefs?
Yes, of course I can. So coral reefs are also at threat from overfishing, and this is when too many fish are removed too quickly for their populations to recover. And it doesn't only impact the fish that are caught, because removing species at any level of the food web can have a cascading effect and can actually put the entire ecosystem off balance. So if you remember back to our last episode episode when we talked about herbivores, which are fish that eat plants off of the reef and are responsible for grazing the algae off of the corals. If these guys are removed, such as the parrotfish or the surgeonfish, then actually the corals suffer more due to the algal overgrowth. So, Chandre, what other threats are the coral reefs that face threat from?
Well, Justine, storms are another major threat to coral reef ecosystems. Powerful tropical storms can actually wipe out years of growth over a single night. The intense wave action can break off individual branches and sometimes destroy entire colonies, which will then leave the reef structure severely damaged. Now, storms have always been a threat in the tropics, but because of climate change, they're becoming more intense and more frequent. And this is leaving the corals with less and less time to recover. And this will this actually makes them more stressed in the long run. But they aren't the only thing that can directly damage coral reefs, are they, Justine?
No, you're absolutely right, not at all. So humans are also responsible for direct habitat destruction through a number of activities, including pollution and coastal development. Corals are really delicate ecosystems, so even the smallest changes is enough to cause large-scale damage. And even things such as increased sediment runoff from rivers that enter the ocean can even cover corals and cause them to die. So now that we have learned a little bit about the threats, what does this actually mean for the coral numbers? Chandre, can you tell us a bit more how about the populations are impacted?
Sure. So because of increasing coral bleaching events and other stresses that these animals go through, coral populations have faced a severe decline over the past few years. This now means that many coral species are actually labeled or classified as endangered or critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. Now, what this IUCN Red List does, it helps scientists identify which species are closest to extinction. They look at the animals all over the world, and it helps them identify which ones are in most need of protection, or whoever needs protection the most. Now, there are a couple of species here in Little Cayman that are critically endangered, which basically means that they are at an extremely high risk of disappearing completely in the near future. So here's the question for you guys. How would you go about protecting endangered corals? Leave your ideas in the chat and we'll let you know a little bit later. But for now, Justine, can you tell us about some of the endangered coral species here in the Cayman Islands?
Yes, I can. Let's have a look at some of these species now. For example, one of the most endangered coral species that we have here is this one, the elkhorn coral. And these are actually critically endangered, meaning that they face an extremely high risk of becoming extinct in the wild. And they are named for their flattened branches, which look a little bit like elk antlers, as you can see here. And they are really good at protecting the coastlines from storms and also providing habitat for other animals to live on the reef. They used to be found all across the Caribbean, but now their numbers are very low. And they were actually very important species in creating habitat structures in the shallow reefs and are very rarely found any deeper than 6 meters. So, Chandre, are there any other species of endangered corals that you can see down there?
Species here on the reef, but there is one in particular that is labeled as critically endangered, and this is the pillar coral. So these stunning coral structures are really rare throughout the Caribbean, but we are fortunate enough to still have a few colonies here around Little Cayman. Their presence has even inspired a project to help us map their locations. There is actually a colony here on Coconut Walk today, so the team and myself are going to try and reposition ourselves so we can show you with our cameras while we do that, Justine, can you explain a little bit about the project that was used to map the locations of these endangered species?
Absolutely. So if you think back to our last episode, we spoke about the importance of monitoring the reef, and this is just another way that CCMI scientists do that. So, while Chandra is busy looking for a live specimen of this guy right here, let's talk a little bit about what the scientists did to search for the pillar corals. So a small team of researchers visited every single dive site across Little Cayman to look for the presence of endangered corals, such as pillar corals, and they mapped their findings. And what they found was that there were 10 colonies remaining, most of which were in good condition, and they can now be visited as part of a dive trip to Little Cayman over here. And luckily, one of those colonies is found, it happens to be on the site that we're currently at, Coconut Walk. So, Chandra, any luck finding it?
We did manage to find it and get close enough to show you guys. So, as you can see, the pillar coral boasts finger-like structures. Now this is a very kind of a small colony, and they can grow up to about 10 feet tall, which helps improve structural complexity of the reef. Now if we get close enough, you get to see their fluffy appearance. This is because pillar coral has polyps that are extended both day and night, which is one of the very few coral species that actually do this. So what we can see is this is a damaged colony because of storms that occurred in Little Cayman. And it broke off a couple of the finger spires that are now strewn out on the sea floor. Despite this though, there is still a little bit of hope, because some of these broken parts have living tissue on it, and with time they may be able to grow and recover. Isn't that cool? So I do have another question for you guys. What is the coolest thing that you have seen underwater? And if you haven't had the opportunity to be in the big blue yet, what is the number one thing on your bucket list? Let us know in the chats. For now, Justine, let us know what you thought of the fluffy pillar coral.
Amazing. Oh, it's super cool to see. Amazing find, Chandra, and it's really great to see that some of these animals are still persisting on our reefs. Thank you very much. But now we're going to have a look at one last species of coral, which has been steadily disappearing from Caribbean waters in recent years and really needs our help. This is the staghorn coral. And these guys used to be very common around the Caribbean, but now they're very difficult to find around Little Cayman. And they are a type of branching coral, and they're very fast growing for a coral, but they're not very resilient to ocean changes. So what can we do to help these corals that are endangered? I'm going to check in the chat now to see if any of our virtual dive buddies had any ideas about how we can save the corals. So let's have a little look here. So we do have some people sending some answers in, and we've got a few questions as well. We will get back to those in a little bit. So there's people saying things like stop driving to stop more pollution. People saying renewable energy, which is a really great idea. And the people saying these kind of things, I see you've learned a lot about climate change, and you'll be very well prepared for our episode next time on the 6th of June. And this is absolutely right. Probably reducing our global carbon emissions is the best way that we can combat climate change and the warming of the waters. This is a massive job though, and whilst we're working on that, there's also something we can do in the meantime. So I'm going to see if anybody's mentioned something like this, and there's people saying stop overfishing and reef restoration. That's really great, and we have a message here saying we can just grow more corals, which is a fantastic idea, and this is actually something that people do. we do grow more corals in order to attach them back onto the reef. And just like growing plants to help restore the forests, growing corals can also help restore the ocean. So thank you for all of your answers, everyone. And we're going to take a little minute now to watch a video about how CCMI is working to restore the coral reefs.
Coral reefs are home to an extraordinary amount of life. Despite only covering a small area along coastlines, they are home to about a quarter of all marine species and offer invaluable services to humanity. They protect coastlines from storms, providing food and jobs for millions. But as ocean temperatures rise and disease outbreaks become more common, we risk the loss of corals, putting an entire ecosystem at risk.
With support from our sponsors, including the UK government's Darwin Plus program,
the Ernest Kleinwort Charitable Trust, and the All Foundation, we're working to save coral reefs.
Using a species called Acropora cervicornis, also known as staghorn coral, we choose corals that can survive heat and disease, growing them in our underwater nursery and planting them back onto the reef. We've been running this program for more than a decade, working towards improved coral restoration, using evidence and science-backed techniques contributing to the resilience and biodiversity of Cayman's reefs.
This project not only aims to rebuild reefs in Little Cayman, but also provides conservation leaders across the Caribbean with solutions for protecting corals. CCMI's researchers are also mapping Little Cayman's reefs to find and document the last remaining endangered coral colonies, also helping to guide protection efforts. Through these projects, CCMI is helping to ensure that both coral reefs and the people who rely on them have a future in a changing climate.
Pretty cool. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as you saw there in the video, one of the ways that we help corals is by growing them in coral nurseries, which is kind of like a garden for small corals where we grow them safely before attaching them back onto the reef. And this process is called coral restoration. And I'm very happy to see that a lot of people in the chat were talking about coral restoration. So I'm glad you guys already know a little bit about it, but we can learn a little bit more, I think. So CCMI started their first coral restoration project as a nursery here in Little Cayman in 2012. And they have been growing these endangered and rare coral species ever since. And the main species that we focus on is actually the staghorn coral. So, we have in fact grown over 1 kilometre of staghorn coral ever since we started, and have made now 3 nurseries around Little Cayman. So, Chandre, can you tell us a little bit more about the coral restoration process?
Of course. So we start by collecting small fragments of staghorn coral from healthy colonies, and we then attach them to nursery frames that look just about like this. Now this is a very small version of the nursery frames that we have. The ones in our nursery are a lot bigger, but it is the same idea. Now, our researchers have the corals attached to the frames, and they carefully clean and monitor the fragments over a process of time to help them grow. Now, they also label the frames according to which genotype they are growing on that particular frame. To put it simply, a genotype is like our unique genetic code that makes us who we are. And just like people have strengths and weaknesses, corals also have strengths and weaknesses. And this brings us to the next step in our process. Justine, could you tell us about CCMI's work in coral resilience?
I sure can. So whilst coral restoration is a really important tool for protecting biodiversity, and it can actually help corals reproduce, the threats that these corals are facing, such as warming waters and diseases, are still increasing. And therefore, it's really important that we focus more on making sure that these corals are as resilient as possible to withstand these threats. So the next step of our work is not only to focus on growing the corals, but also on making sure that they're able to handle any changes in the future under climate change. So that means using scientific experiments to find out which corals are naturally better at handling things like hotter ocean temperatures or diseases. Our researchers did this by exposing different genotypes to different temperatures in the lab in what we call thermotolerance experiments. And this was in order to determine how resilient each genotype is to high temperatures. So, Chandre, can you tell us a bit about what our scientists discovered?
That no single coral is perfect and that there is no single super coral, for instance. They also found that the different genotypes reacted differently to the different stresses. So again, this comes back to the strengths and weaknesses part. Some corals were more resilient to warmer temperatures, some were more resistant to diseases, others were growing faster, and this also explains why it's so important for us to grow a different mix of genotypes. So when challenges do come their way, there is a higher chance that they will survive. Isn't that right, Justine?
That is right, and in fact, when a major bleaching event hit the Cayman Islands in 2023, CCMI's research really paid off. And because we had already studied these corals in the lab and in our nursery, we were able to see which ones withstood the heating event the best. And this real-world event really taught us and identified 3 different genotypes that were able to withstand the hottest marine heat wave and the most extreme marine heat wave that had been recorded. So that was really great news. Chandre, can you talk to us a little bit about what came next?
Sure. So after the 2023 bleaching event, our nursery was severely impacted, and we had lost many corals. However, with funding from the UK government Darwin's Plus program, we have successfully been able to restock our coral nursery with specifically resilient genotypes, and we now have over 100 temperature resilient coral fragments. In addition to being able to withstand warmer oceans, the fragments also successfully survived and recovered from a recent coral disease outbreak in the nursery. These individuals will grow here for a while until they are ready to be outplanted and attached to the reef in the future, hopefully restoring the populations to normal. How cool is that, Justine?
That is pretty cool. Thank you so much for showing us the last step in the coral restoration process, Chandre. And before we end things for the day, because we're getting towards the end of our program, we're going to read out some questions or any answers that you guys have given us in the chat. So we've had a lot of answers about the coolest thing that you guys have seen underwater. So, James wants to see a reef shark, Summer seen an octopus, Ava dolphins, Jackson a killer whale, Jonas and Nathan both have seen stingrays, and Ari has seen a turtle. These are all some really amazing animals that you guys have seen underwater, and I'm really glad that you have been able to see these things, and I hope you are able to see even cooler stuff in the future. So I'm going to read out some questions that you guys have had. Also, I'd love to say a special shout out to Creek and Spot Bay Primary, who are actually also in the video that we just showed. So glad you guys made it into us, and thanks for coming to visit us here at CCMI in Little Cayman. Getting into some questions. Here is one from Lucas, who has asked, how long can corals live for? So I'm going to see if Chandre is doing okay down there with the dive team, and if she's doing all right, then we'll go to her to answer this one. How are you doing, Chandra?
We are doing great down here, Justine. Thank you for checking in on us. To answer Lucas's question, corals have been around for millions of years, and they probably will be around for millions of years if we are able to curb the effects of heating and such. So they're going to be around forever. They're probably older than the dinosaurs.
Great, thanks, Chandra. And we also have another question here from Josh at Village Montessori. Thank you for writing in. He says, can corals get damaged by fishing nets? This is a really good question, and yes, you are absolutely right to think that corals can get damaged by fishing nets. What we see is they can very easily wrap around the corals, and this can damage them. There's another problem as well, which is something called ghost gear. So ghost fishing nets are fishing nets that are no longer attached to a boat because they've been discarded, and these actually usually cause the most problems because they can attach to the net to the reef and basically aren't removed. So these guys float around in the water and they can keep catching fish and turtles and dolphins, sharks, anything, as well as damaging the reef. So yeah, it's really important to maintain sustainable fishing practices. Thank you for these questions. I'll check if there's any more. Let's see if Chandra can answer this one. So Catherine says, do heat-resilient algae play a role in restoration? Chandra, do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
I honestly wish I could. I'm not too familiar with the topic of algae, but it's something I could imagine would happen. Do you have any thoughts on that, Justine?
Let's see, there's many things that algae can help us with in the world, but heat-resilient corals definitely are helping us with restoration, that's for sure. We have a message from class 5L who can't wait to visit CCMI next year, and Willa asks, how long have you been growing corals? So as I said, we started the coral restoration process in 2012, so that is 13 years that we have been doing this coral restoration process and growing the corals here, and as you can see, there are still some that are surviving in the nursery. Luna from St. Ignatius asked, how long have corals been endangered? Chandra, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I honestly think corals have been endangered for as long as they have been threatened. So there was a certain point in the Earth's life cycle that corals were really healthy and warmer temperatures weren't such a bad thing. But now as temperatures are increasing to the point where they cannot survive it, that is where they have become endangered. So I wouldn't say it's so short as in 2-3 years, but it's a lot longer than that. But it is relatively recent if you look at how long corals have been around.
Thank you, Chandra. We have a message from Dario, who is a big fan of Reefs Go Live, so big shout out to you, who asks actually a pretty good question about what the plastic bottles are for on the frames and the reef restoration. So the answer is pretty simple. The bottles are filled with air, and this is just a flotation device to allow the frames to stay upright, because if we didn't have them, then they would actually just fall on the ground. So it's in order to keep the frames straight and upright. Thank you all for your questions. And we are going to go back into the rest of the episode now. So thank you guys all for tuning in, and these were some really brilliant questions, and also for the answers that you sent in to our questions that we had for you. Hope this has taught you a lot and also made you think a little bit. So I also hope that you can now see that by combining hands-on restoration with research, as well as learning more about coral genetics and growing some of these corals to healthy populations, we are giving coral reefs more of a chance at survival. So this allows them to have more time to adapt whilst the rest of the world works on reducing the causes of climate change. And unfortunately, we are now at the end of our broadcast. So we'd like to thank each and every one of you for signing in. And thanks for learning about some of the threats that corals face with us, as well as some of the species that are endangered on Little Cayman's coral reefs. And as well about learning about what CCMI does to help coral restoration. So let's go back down to our underwater team and have a little look for them for one final goodbye.
Okay, I want to say thank you to everybody for being such fantastic dive buddies today. I'm really grateful that you could join us again. I do have a special note. We have our very last episode of Reefs Go Live coming up for the 2025 season. It is on Friday the 6th of June, and this is special because it is for World Oceans Day. And we will be talking about climate change and our oceans. So, for those of you that are in Grand Cayman, we're going to be having a very special screening event in Camana Bay Cinema. And we are very close to a sold-out event, so register with the link in the chat to make sure that we don't miss out. It is free to attend, so get registering. But for now, thank you to everybody for joining, and a special thank you to Luna for showing us a good close-up of the pillar coral. But bye from our underwater team, and we hope to see you on the next one.
Amazing. Thank you guys, and thanks Chandre, and we hope to see all of you next time. But for now, please do be sure to fill in our post-broadcast survey, which you can do via the link in the chat or by scanning the QR code that is on screen now. Thank you very much for that and for joining us, and it's goodbye from all of us here at CCMI.